Welcome! Today we're going to be stitching the lettering for our Be Kind Rainbow hoop, and we are going to be using 938, the dark brown color, and we're only going to be using 3 strands of floss. So if you don't know how to make 3 strands of floss, you need to go back to the setup video where we talked about tracing and setting up our hoop. I also showed you how to thread your needle and split your floss there. I will also link that video in the comments so you can find it easily if you need to. So we're gonna work Be first and then Kind, and I'm gonna use backstitch. With that said, you could use any of the line stitches you've learned. So backstitch, whip backstitch, chain stitch, or stem stitch. All of them will work great for these letters, and the principles for each are the same. So let's quick do a refresher on backstitch. First, we're going to come up the end of our line, make a little straight stitch, then come up that same stitch length away on the line, pull up, go down at the end of the previous stitch, and pull down. That is a backstitch. And then you continue to repeat along the line. Come up a stitch length away, down at the end of the previous stitch, and pull down. Now, you can see that we have 2 different types of lettering. The word Be is hand lettered and is script, which means that it's kind of cursive-y and curly, whereas the word Kind is a block letter. It's got straight pointy edges and it has very few curves, except for those that can't be avoided, like the letter D, which curves. So when I make the word Be here and stitch these curvy lines, I'm going to need to pay attention to my stitch length. First of all, I started out pretty small because the letter itself is not large, so we don't want super large stitches for a small letter. Then second, I'm going to start thinking as I come here into the top of this curve that this is probably the tightest curve, and right here in the letter. So here might need smaller stitches than my main stitch length down this side here. So I'm just going to make sure that I use enough stitches to accent this little part of the curve instead of making it look choppy by using too big of stitches. So you can see here, this stitch is probably about half the size of this bigger stitch here. When this letter is finished, you're not going to notice the difference. All you're going to see is this beautiful brown line twisting over itself to make the letter B. So that would be rule number 1 for all curvy letter stitching. You need to pay attention to the smallest part of the curve and adjust your stitch length accordingly. Smaller, tighter curves, smaller, tighter stitches. Bigger, looser curves, you can do bigger stitches. Always try and be as consistent as you can, but adjust when you need to. Now, we're going to have our lines overlap here in just a second. You can see that my descending line is going to cross this line that we've already stitched. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go my stitch length away down the line, and I'm just going to stitch right over that line and not even worry about it. I do this for 2 reasons. One, when I'm stitching backstitch, it basically disappears, so it doesn't matter at all. If I were doing chain stitch, where you're going to be able to see that overlap a whole lot more, what you're actually doing is you're following the letter the way it was written, which, did I get a knot? I think I did. Hold that thought. When you're doing chain stitch and you see the overlap, the difference is that you're following the way that the letter is written. When you hand letter things like this letter is, it's done in a series of strokes. and the person who wrote it, which is me, does this part first up and this part down. So the way it's written, this part does overlap the next line. The same thing will happen here in the B. It's written as a curve that then comes back over, overlaps, goes under, and then the E overlaps again. So I like to think about this as following the line through, kind of like I've made the letter with a piece of rope. And anytime I have to go back on myself, the rope is just going to overlap. And so my stitches should overlap. It makes it easier to stitch, and it makes a fun effect at the end to have some overlapping stitches. The contrast of that is going to be anytime we have a point, like here. And you can see that I finished my stitch all the way to the bottom, and then I came back up here to then start the B. I don't need to do anything extra to that end. I just need to make sure that a stitch comes to the very bottom of it, and then I continue on the next part where I can see my line as I stitch. Coming to a tight curve. So I could take my stitch length all the way over here, but that's going to leave me very little space to actually round the curve. So I'm going to shorten this stitch up a little bit so that instead of having a point, an end of a stitch right in the middle of the curve, I can instead make a small little straight stitch right here and help the curve feel like it's wrapping around instead of being a point. And there is the letter B done. You can see that the small stitches made beautiful curves. And now we're going to flip our mindset to then work on the word kind. Now first, my thread ended, well, technically right here because it's a back stitch. And so instinct is probably to go up to the top of the K like we write. The problem with that is that we can get a dark line of the thread behind. In this lighting, you can't see much, which is great, but I'm going to go the shorter distance right here to the bottom of the K and decrease my chances of having a big dark line on the back that sometimes can show up in different lighting. So I'm going to continue with back stitch, but I'm going to use bigger stitches because I've got big straight lines this time instead of teeny tiny curvy lines. Okay, again, to prevent crazy lines on the back, I could go up to here and then stitch down and then stitch here, but I'm actually going to take my thread from here to right here so that I can stitch this next line from bottom to top, and again just move my thread a little bit less on the back. Now if that kind of thinking stresses you out and is too much to worry about, don't. Just start wherever you want on the letter and know that you have quality fabric that you're stitching on, and it will do its best to cover up whatever threads are behind. I like to give you these extra little bits to think about because they help elevate your stitching from new beginner to someone who's done it for a while and understands what might be going on. So there's the top of the K, and then I'm going to do again, I'm going to jump to here and stitch down, just keeping my threads closer to the letter so that there's less to see from the front, if you can see anything. Now as I stitch this I, I'm going to take a look over here at this K, this first downstroke, because they're essentially the same line, right? There is line that's the same height as the letters. And I can see that I have 4 stitches in this line. So to help my letters feel consistent, I'm going to try and make 4 stitches again. And you can do this by visually trying to space in your head from here over, Or if I have 4 stitches, I know that stitch number 2 has to be in the middle. So stitch number 1 needs to come in the middle of that space. And again, little things like this is what's going to elevate your stitching and make you look like you totally have all the ideas for what you're doing instead of being the beginner that you probably are, which is great. Everybody has to begin somewhere. Now I can see that my pen probably caught a thread and curved to the right just a little bit for that eye. So I'm going to choose to put my needle to the side of it to then make a straight letter instead of stitching exactly on the line. And I can do this because my pen erases, so I'm not leaving any marks of any kind on the fabric when I'm done. Now, my thread is here, and I could jump to here, but instead I'm going to come down here because these are pretty close together, and it will make stitching the N a lot cleaner and easier than if I were to go the actual shortest distance between these 2 letters. And again, this left-hand side of the N is the same height as the I and the K, so I'm going to try and match stitches again and make them all be the same length. And there you have it. Our lettering is finished. I'm going to tie off this end, and then there will be one more video where I'm going to show you how to erase any of the little lines that you can see and finish your hoop.